Hello, readers. How are you? Liking a good story, are ya? Here we go. Look, I like that scarf with this. Was outside for a little bit. We got some nice sunshine. We can't get vitamin D in the sun at this time in Michigan. So still have to supplement, but it's always good to get a little bit outside, isn't it? How about that? Yeah. Something like that. Oh, okay. We are reading the classic story Heidi. We should be on chapter 10 because it's day 10. What, 11? No, 10. A grandmama. It's where we left it 4 days ago. She didn't know what a grandmama was exactly. And I forgot where we were on grandmama. Busy preparations went on the day that Mrs. Seisman was to arrive. It was easy to perceive that the expected guest had a decided control over the household and that everyone felt the greatest respect for her. Tinette had a fine new white headdress for the occasion, and Sebastian got together with a multitude of footstools and put them in every possible place so that the lady might find one ready wherever she should choose to be seated. The housekeeper went round through the rooms, setting everything in order, as much as to say that although another person with authority was about to appear, she was not to be extinguished. At last, a carriage rolled up before the house. Tinette and Sebastian ran down the stairs. Slowly and with dignity, Miss Rottenmeier followed, for she knew that she must receive Mrs. Seisman. Heidi had been ordered to withdraw into her own room to wait until she was sent for, as the grandmamma naturally would hasten to Clara and wish to be alone with her. Seating herself therefore in her bedroom, she repeated over and over again the strange way in which she was to address Mrs. Seisman. She did not understand it, for she had always heard the title placed before the name and not after. So she presently conceived that Miss Rottenmeier had but tripped in her speech, and she turned the words about accordingly. She had not long to wait, however, for Tinette soon appeared and said shortly as usual, "You are wanted in the study." As Heidi opened the door, she was greeted by the friendly voice of Mrs. Seisman. "Ah, there comes the child. Come here to me, and let me take a good look at you." Heidi entered, and in her clear voice said very distinctly, "Good day, Mrs. Gracious." "That is not bad," said Grandmamma, laughing. "Do they say so where you live? Have you heard that at home on the Alp?" "No, there is no one of that name where I live," said the child seriously. "Nor here that I know of," said Mrs. Seisman pleasantly, and patted the child on the cheek. "In the nursery I am always Grandmamma. You must call me so too. Can you remember that?" "Yes, yes, indeed. I was going to say so," said Heidi. "Oh, I understand now," the grandmamma said, and nodded her head, much amused. Then she looked steadily at the little girl for some time, nodding again as if in sign of approval, and Heidi looked straight into the kind eyes that were regarding her and felt quite happy. She could not turn away indeed. Mrs. Seisman had such soft white hair, and round her head a beautiful lace was twisted with two wide ribbons that hung down from the cap, and that were always moving a little, as if a light breeze stirred about the grandmamma, to Heidi's infinite delight. "And what is your name, my child?" was the next question. "My name is Heidi, but if I must be called Adelheid, I will pay attention." And the little girl said the little girl, and choked a little, for she felt guilty, as she did not always answer promptly when Miss Rottenmeier called her by that name, which she could not rightly recognize as hers. With the words, the housekeeper had entered the room. Mrs. Seisman will undoubtedly agree with me, said she, that I must choose a name that can be spoken without annoyance, were only the servant's account. My good Rottenmeier, said Mrs. Seisman, if anyone is called Heidi and is accustomed to the name, I use it, and no other. It is very disagreeable to the housekeeper to be called by her surname without a preceding title, but there was no help for it. The grandmamma had her own way of doing things, and it was a way not to be opposed. In full possession of her five senses, sharp and healthy ones too, was Mrs. Seisman, and the moment she saw the child, she knew what was amiss with her. When Clara, on the day after her grandmamma's arrival, disposed herself for her daily rest, the old lady took an armchair near her and closed her eyes too for a few moments. She soon rose again, however, for she was quickly refreshed. She went into the dining room. No one was to be seen. Oh, all asleep, she said to herself, and went to the housekeeper's room and knocked loudly. After a little while, Miss Rottenmeier appeared and started back in alarm at this unexpected visit. Where does the child stay at this time, and what does she do? That is what I wish to know, said Mrs. Seisman. She sits in her bedroom, where she might employ herself if she knew how, or had the slightest idea of anything useful. But Mrs. Seisman ought to know what mad projects the child gets up one after another, and often carries out too, things that in polite society can scarcely even be mentioned. That is just what I should do if I were obliged to sit alone there as that child does. Then you might see how you would speak of my goings on in polite society. Go now and fetch the child to me in my room, where I have some pretty books that I have brought with me. So there's Grandmama. Uh-oh, Heidi looks like she's crying. This is the most miserable thing about it. This is just it, cried Miss Rottenmeier, and clasped her hands together. What can that child do with books? And all this time she has not learned her alphabet. It is impossible to give her the least idea of reading. The professor can tell you all about that. If the man did not possess the patience of an angel from heaven, he would have given up the lesson long ago. Now that strikes me as strange, said Mrs. Seisman. The little girl does not look like one who could not learn her letters. Go and fetch her. She can at least look at the pictures. Miss Rottenmeier had still more to say, but Miss Seisman was already moving briskly toward her own room. She was greatly surprised at the account of the child's backwardness and determined to find out what it meant, but not from the professor, whose excellent character she prized highly and to whom she always extended a friendly greeting when they met, but whose presence she fled for fear of being entangled in conversation with him, for his way of expressing himself was a little tiresome to her. Heidi came to the grandmama's room and opened wide eyes when she saw all the beautiful pictures in the big books on Mrs. Seisman's table. Suddenly she cried out as a leaf was turned and looked with eager eyes at the pictures before her, then broke forth into tears and heavy sobs. The grandmama exclaimed the grandmama examined the picture. It was a beautiful green field where all sorts of animals were feeding and nibbling at the green bushes. In the midst stood a shepherd leaning on his crook and surveying his happy flocks. Everything was flooded with a shimmering golden radiance, for the sun was just sinking behind the horizon. Taking the child kindly by the hand, the grandmama said soothingly, Come, my child, do not cry. This has probably reminded you of something. But look, there is a pretty story all about the pictures. I will tell it to you this evening. There are all sorts of nice stories in this book that one can read and tell over. Now let us have a little talk together. There, dry your eyes and put yourself right here, right in front of me, so that I can look at you. Yes, that is right. Now we are happy. It was some time, however, before Heidi was tranquil again. Then the grandmama said, "Now tell me, my child, how do you like your lessons with the professor? Do you learn easily, and have you got on well?" "Oh, no," answered Heidi, sighing, "but I knew beforehand that I could not learn." "Why can't you learn, child?" "What do you mean?" "That some people cannot learn to read. It is too hard." "Indeed. And where did you pick up this wonderful piece of news?" "Peter told me so, and he knows very well. He has been trying, but he never can learn. It is too hard." "Well, that must be a queer kind of a Peter. But really, Heidi, you must not take for granted what such a Peter as that says, but must try for yourself. Perhaps you have not given close attention to what the professor says, and have not looked at the letters." "It is no use," said the child in a tone of one thoroughly convinced of the uselessness of trying. "Heidi," said Mrs. Seisman gravely, "I'm going to tell you something. You have not learned to read because you have believed what your Peter said. Now you must believe me, and I tell you without doubt that you can learn to read, and in a short time too, as all children do who are like you and not like Peter. And now hear what will come next. When you have learned to read, you saw the shepherd in the beautiful green meadow. Now, as soon as you have learned to read, you shall have that book, and then you can understand the whole story, just as if someone told it to you, all about what he does with his sheep and goats, and what wonderful things happen to him and them. That you would like to know, I am sure." The child had listened with sparkling eyes to all that had been said, and now replied with deep drawn breath, Oh, if I could read. That will come soon. You will not have long to wait, my child. I see you will only have to try. But now we must go to Clara. Come, we will take the pretty books with us." A great change had taken place in Heidi since the day when Miss Rottenmeier had stopped her on the steps in her flight toward her home. The housekeeper had told her then that she was very ungrateful, and that Mr. Seisman must never know about it. She understood that she could not go home again whenever she wished, as her Aunt Deet had assured her she could, and that Mr. Seisman would be displeased with her for wishing to go. And she reasoned in her own mind that Clara and Grandmama would think the same, so she did not dare tell anyone of her longing, for fear of making the Grandmama, who was so kind to her and whom she loved dearly already, as angry as Miss Rottenmeier had been. The thought of that the child could not endure. I came and I brought my iced tea and I didn't take a drink. Really wanted to put a lemon in there. It's so clear and pretty, though. When I don't have a lemon in there, then it gets all murky when I do. But I really would like it because it cuts on the bitterness a little bit. So the burden within Heidi's heart became heavier and still heavier. She could not eat, and she grew paler every day. At night it was often a long time before she could get to sleep, for as soon as everything was quiet, the elm and the sunshine upon it, and the flowers came so vividly before her eyes, and when she at last slept, the red pinnacles of Falkness and the fiery snowfield of Casplana came to her in her dreams, and she awoke full of joy, ready to spring out of bed, and then, oh, it was the big bed in Frankfurt, far, far away from home, and she could not get back. Then she would hide her face in her pillow and cry for a long time, but quietly, so that no one could hear her. Her unhappy condition did not, however, escape the vigilant eyes of Mrs. Seisman. She let several days elapse to see if the depression did not pass, but this not being the case, and the child's eyes betraying often in the early morning that she had been weeping, she took Heidi one day into her room again and said, with great kindness, Tell me, Heidi, what is your trouble? But this good grandmama must not know what an ungrateful child she had before her, thought Heidi, and feared to lose her love. So she said sadly, It isn't anything that I can tell. No? Cannot you tell Clara? Oh no, not anybody, said Heidi. And Heidi looked so miserable all the while that Mrs. Seisman's heart ached for her. Then I will tell you something, my child. When one has a sorrow that cannot be told to anybody on earth, it must be confided to the good God, and he must be asked for help and comfort, for he can make your sorrows lighter and teach us to bear them. You understand, do you not? You pray every evening to the dear Father in heaven to thank him for all that he sends you and ask him to protect you from evil. No, I never do that, said Heidi. Have you ever learned to pray, Heidi? Do you know what it is? With my first grandmother, I did, but it is so long ago that I have forgotten about it. Now I see, Heidi, why you are so very unhappy. It is because you do not know of anyone who can help you. Just think how happy it is for those who have heavy hearts to be able to go to the good God at all times and beg him for help, and he can help us and make us happy again. Through Heidi's eyes flashed a joyful light. Can we tell him everything? Everything? Everything, Heidi, everything. Drawing her little hand out of Grandmama's, the child asked breathlessly, May I go? And the little one ran quickly to her room, seated herself on her footstool, folded her hands, and told all the sorrow of her heart to God, begging and beseeching him to help her to get away, to go home to her grandfather on the elm. It may have been something more than a week from this time that the professor one day asked permission to pay his respects to Mrs. Seisman, as he had an important communication to impart to her. He was invited to her room and kindly greeted by Mrs. Seisman, who extended her hand cordially toward him, saying, My dear professor, I'm glad to see you. Be seated, pray. And she gave him a chair. There now, tell me what brings you here. No bad news, I trust. No complaints. On the contrary, gracious lady, something has taken place that I did not expect, and that no one who had been cognizant of what has gone before could have foreseen. For judging from the past, it would have been considered an impossibility, and yet it has taken place, and that too in a most remarkable way. Has Heidi begun to learn to read, Professor? The astonished gentleman stared at Mrs. Seisman in speechless surprise. It is truly wonderful, said he, at length finding his voice, that this girl, who, notwithstanding all my pains, has not been able to learn the alphabet, has all at once, and just as I had decided to give up as impossible of achievement the attempt even of bringing the simple letters before her, the girl all at once, overnight, so to speak, has begun to read, and that too with a correctness that is rare in beginners. But it is almost as wonderful to me that the gracious lady should have divined that obscure fact. A great many wonderful things take place in this world, Professor, said Mrs. Seisman with a smile of satisfaction. Two things sometimes take place at the same time, a new desire to learn, say, and a new method of teaching. Neither of them is bad, my dear Professor, and we will rejoice that the child has begun so well, and hope for continuance in well-doing. With these words, she accompanied the professor to the door and went straight to the study to confirm with her own eyes the pleasant news. It was true. There sat Heidi by Clara's side, reading a story, astonished even at herself, and penetrating with constantly increasing interest the new world that she had opened before her, as suddenly the black letters turned into men and things taking life and revealing wonderful stories. And when you think about that, they're just black marks on a page turned into wonderful, enchanting interesting stories. And on that very evening, when Heidi took her seat at table there, on her plate lay the beautiful book. And when she glanced inquiringly toward Mrs. Seisman, the latter said kindly, "Yes, yes, it is yours." "Forever, even when I go home?" asked Heidi, quite red with joy. "Yes, certainly forever. Tomorrow we will begin to read it." "But you will not go home for many years yet, Heidi," said Clara. "When my grandmama goes away, then you will really begin to live with me." Once more, before going to sleep, Heidi looked at the new book in her own room, and always after, it was her favorite occupation to read and reread the stories that belonged to the beautiful colored pictures. If the grandmama said in the evening, "Now, Heidi, read something to us," then the child was perfectly happy. It was now quite easy for her to read, and when she read aloud, she understood better, and then Mrs. Seisman could explain so much and added so much that was new. The favorite picture was always the green pasture, not look golden, and the land was gray and misty. One other picture belonged to the story. There the father came with outstretched arms from the house and ran toward the repentant son to receive and welcome him. As ragged and famished, he drew near his home. This was Heidi's favorite story that she would read again and again aloud to herself, and she never tired of the explanations that Mrs. Seisman gave of it to the children. So the time drew near all too quickly when the dear grandmama's visit must come to an end. And that story is the parable of the prodigal son from the Bible, from Scripture. And I remember those pictures. I feel like I remember those pictures. Like the pictures in the story she's reading. Because the prodigal son in the Bible doesn't come with pictures. I feel like I remember the Bible stories. It's so interesting too. To me, I'm just going to comment for a minute. And how beautiful the scene is with all the grasslands. And how many people said the Middle East used to be so beautiful in the stories and in what they've said. So Iran used to be so beautiful. And Afghanistan was so beautiful. And I get that there's a lot of destruction, but I don't get why our country would in any way be a destroyer of beauty. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thanks for joining me here in the reading room where we are reading the classic story Heidi by Johanna Spyri. And because this is all part of a healthy mind, body, spirit. I will see you in Early Bird Classroom tomorrow morning, 8:30 sharp, or kind of sharp, maybe a little dull. I'm not sure. Thanks for joining me.